Welcome to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we are tackling something incredibly ambitious. We're going to break down the massive 2,500-year history of Buddhism. To do this right, we're going to start by zooming all the way out to look at the ancient socioeconomic conditions of the world back then, and then we'll zoom all the way back in, right down to the life of a young, motherless prince. It's an amazing story, so let's dive right in.
Now, right off the bat, we run into this really fascinating contradiction. We usually think of Buddhism as an escape from worldly desires, right? But the crazy thing is, Buddhism was actually born during India's highly prosperous 6th century BCE. Globally, historians call this the Axial Age. You can think of it kind of like a modern industrial or tech revolution. It was this intense period of unprecedented wealth, the sudden rise of massive cities, and just a booming economy. So you have to ask yourself, how exactly did this super wealthy, hyper-urban environment create a religion entirely focused on renunciation?
Well, here's our roadmap for today to figure that out. 1. The 6th century revolution. 2. Many branches of Buddhism. 3. Decoding the source texts. 4. Birth of a prince. And finally, 5. The emperor or ascetic.
All right, kicking things off with Part 1, the 6th century revolution, the economics of a new religion.
To really grasp this era, we have to look at the big picture. The 6th century BCE was a time of massive political and economic upheaval across regions known as the Mahajanapadas, and it all kicked off an unbelievable economic chain reaction. Step 1. Iron tools. The widespread use of iron meant people could clear dense forests and plow deeper into the earth. That, of course, led directly to a massive agricultural surplus. Suddenly, people had way more crops than they needed, so they started trading. This exploded into the rise of urban centers, huge markets, and a newly wealthy merchant class. But here is the massive pivot. The dominant Brahminical religion of the time relied heavily on animal sacrifices for its rituals. But these new farmers and merchants, they literally needed those animals, especially oxen, to keep this new agricultural economy running. So new religions started popping up that heavily promoted nonviolence, or ahimsa, in a large part simply to protect the economic engine of farm animals.
So, this huge economic shift totally empowered the wealth-generating merchant class, the Vaishyas, and the warrior ruler class, the Kshatriyas, who were the ones suddenly collecting all these massive taxes. They grew really frustrated with the old Brahminical dominance and started throwing their weight behind alternative movements. Get this, there were 62 different Shraman, or wandering seeker, movements during this era. 62! These ascetics were actively rebelling against the traditional order, trying to find spiritual truth entirely through their own efforts.
This era was a fiercely competitive marketplace of ideas. The Buddha was absolutely not the only thinker out there. For example, you had Mahavira, who built Jainism around strict nonviolence. Then you had Makali Goshala preaching absolute determinism, basically telling people, hey, your fate is fixed. Karma doesn't change a thing. On the other extreme, you had Ajita Kesakambali, a strict materialist, who flat out said there is no soul, no rebirth, only physical elements. And you even had thinkers like Sanjaya Bilathiputta arguing for total agnosticism, claiming it's literally impossible to ever know the absolute truth.
Okay, moving right along to Part 2, Many Branches of Buddhism, the Evolution of the Faith.
The most crucial thing to understand here is that the Buddhism you know depends entirely on what era of history you're actually looking at. When the Buddha passed away in 483 BCE, there were 0 books. The first council was completely oral. His disciples just recited the rules and teachings entirely from memory. It wasn't until hundreds of years later, around 29 BCE at the Fourth Council, that these teachings were physically written down for the first time. Then, a couple of centuries after that, Mahayana Buddhism takes off, which begins deifying the Buddha and adding in all these intense miracles and gods. And then fast forward all the way to 1956, when Dr. B.R. Ambedkar sparked Navayana, or New Vehicle, Buddhism in India. This was a total revival that returned the faith to a highly rational, logic-based interpretation.
And that brings us to Part 3, Decoding the Source Texts, Myth versus Rationality.
Because of that huge timeline we just looked at, we're dealing with 2 radically different types of source texts today. On one hand, we have the ancient Buddha Charita, written by the great poet Ashvaghosha. This was written centuries after the Buddha lived, and heavily leans into that Mahayana tradition, so it is absolutely packed with miracles, gods flying down from the heavens, and supernatural interventions. But on the exact opposite side of the spectrum, we have Dr. Ambedkar's 1957 text, The Buddha and His Dhamma. Ambedkar demands absolute logical consistency. He systematically strips away all the supernatural stuff to try and uncover the actual scientific and social reality of who the Buddha was.
Let me give you a perfect example.
You know the traditional story, right? A 29-year-old Siddhartha wanders outside his palace and sees an old man, a sick man, and a corpse for the very first time in his life, and that sparks his awakening. Well, listen to how Dr. Ambekar sharpens his logical knife here. He writes, "I cannot accept that a 29-year-old youth had never seen an old person or a sick person. How is this possible?" It's a great point, right? It really forces us to look past the mythology and start searching for the actual historical reality.
So let's find that historical reality in Part 4, Birth of a Prince, zooming in to the Kapilavastu Republic.
Siddhartha was born in a place called Kapilavastu, but to really understand his upbringing, we have to look at the political reality of where he lived. You need to drop the idea of a massive, untouchable, absolute monarchy. Kapilavastu wasn't that at all. It was actually a small, semi-independent republic. It functioned almost like a vulnerable, protected state that was heavily influenced by its giant neighbor, the Kosala Empire. It wasn't ruled by a single tyrant. It was governed by councils and a leading executive.
And the dynamics of this little republic were almost entirely dictated by his immediate family. Let's meet them. Suddhodana is his father, and he serves as the executive head of the republic. Mahamaya is his biological mother. Tragically, she passes away shortly after he is born, leaving her sister, Mahaprajapati, to actually step in and raise the prince. We've also got two super important cousins in the mix. Devadatta, who is going to become the ultimate antagonist and rival to the Buddha, and Ananda, who eventually becomes his most loyal, closest disciple.
Now, the traditional narrative tells us that before the birth, Queen Mahamaya had this unbelievably vivid dream. She dreamt that gods literally lifted her bed, carried her all the way to the Himalayas, bathed her in a sacred lake, and signaled that a great being was coming. When she woke up, King Suddhodana immediately called in 8 top scholars to interpret what it meant, and they gave him a dual prophecy. This child was destined for absolute greatness, but it would go one of 2 ways. He would either become a Chakravartin, a world-conquering emperor, or he would abandon it all to become a savior ascetic, a Buddha.
This prophecy gets confirmed a bit later by a legendary Himalayan sage named Acharya Asita, who travels down just to see the newborn. But when Asita looks at the baby, he suddenly bursts into tears. The king is, understandably, absolutely terrified, thinking his son is cursed. But Asita looks at him and says, "I weep because I will not live long enough to see his spiritual empire. I will not be alive when the world kisses his feet." Now, the rest of the kingdom was thrilled at the idea of a spiritual savior, but King Suddhodana, he was horrified. He wanted an emperor for a son, not a wandering monk.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, The Emperor or Ascetic, the Clash of Ideologies. But before any of that ideological clash can happen, real tragedy strikes the family. Just 7 days after giving birth in the gardens of Lumbini, Queen Mahamaya passes away. So the infant, now named Siddhartha Gautama, is essentially orphaned of his biological mother in the very first week of his life. He is taken in and raised with incredible love by his aunt, Mahaprajapati. But you can imagine how that early, profound loss looms over his entire story.
Fast forward a bit. By age 8, the young prince begins his formal education. And frankly, the kid is an absolute prodigy. He rapidly masters language, grammar, and the complex ancient philosophies of the Vedas and the Upanishads. Realizing just how brilliant his son is, Suddhodana brings in highly specialized teachers, including the renowned Acharya Bharadwaj. Under him, Siddhartha dives deep into the meditative practices of Sankhya and yoga. He's learning these intense arts of deep concentration and physical discipline. His mind is basically being honed into this razor-sharp philosophical tool.
But a massive rift is forming between father and son. Suddhodana is desperately trying to force the first half of that prophecy to come true. He initiates this strict kshatriya plan. He forces Siddhartha to learn warfare, hunting, and violence, telling him it's just the duty of a ruler. But Siddhartha just isn't wired that way. He has a fundamentally peaceful nature. He outright refuses to hunt. And when he's told that a ruler has to use violence to protect the state, the young prince actually pushes back. He asks why neighboring states can't just use diplomacy, dialogue, and sheer intelligence to solve their conflicts instead of shedding blood. So, what does this all mean? We are left with this incredible, burning question. We've got this young, fiercely intelligent, deeply peace-loving prince. He's sitting right at the epicenter of a massive Iron Age economic revolution that is totally upending the social order of the world, and he is trapped under the thumb of a father who is absolutely obsessed with molding him into a violent warlord emperor. The tension is literally at a breaking point. How in the world will Siddhartha Gautama ever escape this golden cage to become the Buddha? Well, that is exactly what we're going to uncover in our next explainer.
Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.